Well, hello everybody. Pastor Joel here with you one more time for the past days with ba-da-bum-bum-bum-bum. Feel like we need some kind of theme in there. Anybody know how to do that, like for free? Anyway, before we get into today's topic, which is this generation, a phrase Jesus was known to have used on a couple of occasions, want to mention a couple things. If you are benefiting from this content in some way and you are not yet subscribed to the channel, please do that. Like, share, subscribe, share it with people that won't even like me or won't like the content, or both. I like to engage with them as well. It's not all about me. Believe me, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I wanted everything to be about me, and it almost killed me. True story. It's about everyone knowing Jesus, and I want everyone to know the Jesus that I believe the Scripture gives to us. And so like, subscribe, share this content, and remember, whoever ends up being subscriber 125, I think we're at 121 now, 125, you can let me know in a comment on a video, or you can track me down on Facebook and say, hey, I'm subscriber 125, and you can let me know what video you would like me to do. It doesn't even have to be about eschatology. So how's that for a deal? Second thing, before we get into this generation, if you have not yet seen this podcast, The Burros of Berea, it's something you should be familiar with. It's a group of folks who sit around and they talk about the Bible. They don't all share the same perspective, which is really cool. And they actually are up to 40,000 listeners now, so it's awesome. And a couple of the hosts have come to preterism, and so they're making that topic have a little more play there, but they also discuss a lot of other really interesting biblical things. So you should check it out, The Burros of Berea. And it is Wednesday as I'm filming this, Wednesday, August 2nd. It might not drop today because when I'm in my truck, I don't have internet. I just have whatever cell reception I had. The last video, it literally took me 2 days before I could get it to upload because I didn't have any service. And so, excuse me just one moment. Whew! Glad I actually sneezed. I had one of those things the other day, like a no sneeze. And that's weird. It's a little more gratifying when you actually get to sneeze. So, at any rate, Burros of Berea, the reason I'm mentioning that is that tomorrow, August 3rd, an interview that I was able to do with them drops. And you're going to hear a little bit more about my testimony and hear a little bit more about how I came to preterism, which some of you will already know. But you might want to check that out, and you can share that as well, and I'll get it on my page too after it's out. Just had to get rid of a message there. And so, let's head into this generation. Now, this generation, whatever Jesus meant by that, is obviously huge when it comes to eschatology, and there are basically two views. Either Jesus meant this generation, and he was speaking to his contemporary generation, or when he said this generation, he actually meant that generation, a generation far, far, far off in the future. Many people would think that we are in that generation now. Others would say it's very, very close. The post-mill folks might say it's not for quite a while yet. But basically, he was either talking to his contemporaries or he was talking to somebody else. And just the last couple days, I was engaging a bit with somebody on Facebook who doesn't know I'm a preterist at this point. By the way, and I don't mind telling people that. I prefer the term fulfilled eschatology, I guess is my preferred pronouns. But the word preterist is fine. It just means, it's from the Latin praetor, and it just means past. But sometimes when I'm engaging with people, the moment you say that, then that's going to color how they see you, and automatically they throw you in this heretic category that obviously doesn't take the Bible seriously. So sometimes just ask people questions and don't give that away right up front so you can have some meaningful conversations. So anyway, started engaging with this guy, and he's saying that all preterists have is generation. That's all they have. Now clearly, and probably a very nice gentleman, but clearly not informed at all, because there is so much scripture, like some of you, I'm guessing. I tried to get myself out of this. I tried to read myself out of it. I tried to think myself out of it. Tried to make the Bible say things it didn't say. I read several books and articles against preterism because I just thought this is so nuts. But the fact is, there is so much scripture. So for someone to say all preterists have is that when Jesus said this generation, that's what he meant, is just, I'm sorry, it's just really ignorant, and somebody who probably hasn't actually asked preterists what they think, or hasn't done a lot of research. Now, on the one hand, this generation is very powerful, and the plain reading of what it seems to be would be a lot to be able to persuade people to this view. But there's something else about this generation that often isn't talked about as much, and I want to hit that just a little bit. Now before I do that, I want to remind you, because some people took advantage of this and said it was very helpful. I recommended an app in my last video called the Literal Word app. Literal Word, it's free. I think it's only in the NASB, which is a decent translation. Maybe in other translations now, but when I got it, probably almost a couple years ago now, it was just in that translation. Another person chiming in. I am so popular today. At any rate, Literal Word, what's nice about it is it's really easy to use, and you can take any word on there, and then you can just hold your finger on it, and if you're in the New Testament, it'll give you the Greek term for that. If you're in the Old Testament, it'll give you the Hebrew term. The other really neat thing it does is that it tells you how many verses that's used in, and then it shows all those verses. So I'm not going to do it in this video. We may do it in another one. But one thing you might do, it's Matthew 23:36. Jesus has just been, excoriating the Pharisees with a passage that's sometimes referred to as the 7 woes. Woe to you, Pharisees, you blind guides. Woe to you, Pharisees, you hypocrites. Woe to you, Pharisees, you go everywhere to make converts, and you make them twice as much a son of Gehenna as you. I mean, it's extreme, the strongest language that's recorded that Jesus ever used. And he said things like, if I had ever said them as a pastor, I would have been fired before half of them got out of my mouth. At any rate, it's an intense portion of Scripture, Matthew 23, and at the end of Matthew 23 in verse 36, he says that this generation is going to be responsible for the blood of all the prophets, going all the way back to Abel and so forth. It's a very, very strong passage, and I don't know of anyone who would say that Jesus is actually talking about other people. He's clearly talking to them, focused primarily on the religious leaders, and it's because they're guilty by association of murdering the prophets. That particular generation, remember when Pilate washed his hands, didn't really want to have Jesus crucified, but felt like he had to do it because of his position, and felt forced into it as procurator of the Roman Empire. And at any rate, he ends up saying, I wash my hands of this, his blood be on your heads. And do you remember what the people say? His blood be on our heads and on the heads of our children. That was a very common way of Jews talking about one generation, people living and their children. So for instance, when Jesus is walking to the cross and these women are crying, he turns to them and says, mourn not for me, but mourn for yourselves. And then he talks about how it's going to be so difficult for women and their children and so forth. And it's the same thing. It's one generation. Another thing that most people will agree on is a biblical generation is considered to be about 40 years. All through the Scriptures, you've got people fasting for 40 days. You've got Israel wandering for 40 years. You've got Jonah going to Nineveh, warning of impending doom in 40 days. So there's all these 40s all over the place, and that was always kind of recognized as a biblical generation until when Israel became a nation in 1948, and nothing happened by 1988. That a lot of people that coming from a dispensational or futurist point of view in regards to eschatology believed because Israel was made a nation in 1948 that Jesus should have returned by 1988. 40 years, and so a lot of them placed the rapture in 81, 7 years prior. That didn't happen, and then when Israel had the war in 67, then it was, well, maybe that's it, so it would have been then 2007. The point is that there was really almost universal agreement, as far as I'm aware, that a biblical generation was 40 years until these things haven't happened. And so now people are saying, and this happened, I called into a radio station the other day, I shared that in another video, and that's one of the other things the guy was saying. Now we know a generation can stretch out to 80 or 100 years or more. Where do we find that, sir? It's nowhere. So going back to Matthew 23, when Jesus is ripping the Pharisees and religious leaders a new one, he's making it clear that this particular generation, they were going to be held accountable and responsible for all those things. And I don't know of any scholars that disagree that Jesus was talking about to those specific people because they were the ones that committed those particular crimes for which they were going to be held accountable. We go through Matthew 24, we get to Matthew 24, verse 34, which says all these things, the wars, the rumors of wars, the false Messiah, the abomination of desolation, and so on, the gospel going out to the world. Jesus says all these things will take place before this generation comes to pass. And all of a sudden people say, now he's talking about a different generation. Let's remember something. And I know many of you know all this, but it's so important. The original scrolls did not have verses, did not have chapters. You see, that's one of our problems in interpreting Scripture. We get to a new chapter and we assume it's sort of a new topic. And that's how books are written today. All about one general topic, but each chapter tends to take a little bit of that puzzle and then it's put together in the whole book. Not so. They didn't have chapters and verses, so Jesus is talking about the same thing. There's another issue, and you may be familiar with this term. Inclusio is the term. We could say bookends. And this generation in 23:36, Matthew 23 and 36, and then Matthew 24 and 34 is an inclusio, which means, in other words, everything in between there is held together. Jesus is talking there about the same thing. That is actually how the writers were very intentional, or in this case the speakers, in doing that, so that before there were chapters and verses, it would be easy for people to keep track of what was written. So there would be these sections, often with an inclusio at the beginning and inclusio at the end, so they could help find their place and know how the themes and topics connect. So what you might consider doing, get that literal word app, and in Matthew 23:36 or Matthew 24:34, it doesn't matter, press in the word generation. It's going to pull up the Greek word genia. And then you can see where it's found in all these other verses. And in every time, in any of the Gospels, that generation is referred to, it's always that same Greek term, genia. And it always is referring to the particular contemporaries that were there. So there is no hermeneutical, exegetical justification for saying that in Matthew 24:34, then Jesus has switched to a different type of generation. He's used the same word. That's a good way to study the Bible. How are the terms used other place in Scripture? And people will admit that until they get to that spot. They say it couldn't happen then, but you might want to do that. And there's lots of verses, particularly in Matthew. And go to all those verses and show somebody, in every single one of these, the same term for generation is used, genia, and it always and only points to the contemporary generation. What then gives you justification? You futurist! Just kidding. Like I said, we got to love them. I talked about that. I don't even know what happened there. Sometimes something happens. But there's just simply no justification for doing it. But there are still those who will say, well, I'm just not going there with you. They won't acknowledge the timing of that. They won't acknowledge other time statements. So here's another way you can talk about this generation that I don't hear talked about as often, but to me it's really powerful. Which generation did Jesus say in Matthew 23 was responsible? Again, guilt by association with all the prophets in the Old Testament, going all the way back to Abel, and then starting with Samuel and the what's often called the true line of prophets, and so on. So many of them were mistreated, thrown in pits. Jeremiah was put in the stocks. Some were killed, and Jesus is saying that those people were guilty of that. And remember, they had just said, "His blood be on us and on our children." Jesus also says they would kill those coming to them, the scribes, who there's pretty broad agreement that would refer to the apostles, who were the scribes of the New Testament. So they were also going to kill them. They were also going to murder their Messiah. Tell me, is there any other generation after that generation that committed those particular crimes? Of course not. It's impossible. It's impossible. And that is a good way for those that just keep talking about, well, that generation means something different at this time. If they simply will not budge on that, ask them, whatever generation it was, what were they guilty of? And Jesus had made it abundant and clear in Matthew 23. There's just no way to wiggle out of that. And the way I think about it, this is a crude example. Okay, when I have kids, a lot of you have kids. And whether or not you're in favor of corporal punishment, don't worry about that. I'm not making a case for or against that. But this is a good example, even though it's a little bit crude. If Jesus was going to, pour out all his wrath on some sort of future generation, it would be like your own kids misbehaving, but instead of you spanking them, you spank your great 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 grandchildren who had nothing to do with the particular crimes for which your children should have been held accountable. I think this is strong and very persuasive, and again, I don't hear it talked about all that much. It's impossible for there to be any other generation of people that were to be punished for those specific crimes that Jesus had outlined. Further, and we'll have to do other videos on this, you go all the way back to Deuteronomy 28 through about 32, especially in there, and you see over and over that Israel was going to meet her final end, that she was going to be judged, and there was going to be, Moses was looking forward to this final generation of Israel. And so let me encourage you to do something else. The next time you're reading through the New Testament and you see something like this evil and perverse generation where you know what we used to do, oh, this world is just so evil. It's so evil. Evil, 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 evil. I'm not saying there isn't some evil going on right now, but the point is we would take all that, and at least I did, and I completely missed that the New Testament writers, they're talking about the same thing. That particular generation, sometimes called a wayward generation, sometimes an evil generation, rebellious generation. They're talking all about that last and final generation of Israel whom Jesus was speaking about and to in Matthew 23, and then going on into the events of Matthew 24. It's the same people. It's that generation. Talking about my generation, my being Jesus, that's what he was saying. And this is so important, again, not only to get the timing, not only to go and see that the Greek word is the same for every other reference of generation, but why? Whatever generation was to be punished, why were they to be punished? And there's no one else that qualifies. No one else at all. I'm just getting all kinds of messages here. Apologize, but I'm not going to edit this. And so I think we'll leave it there for now. Again, there are many other scriptures, and so this gentleman I was interacting with, so all they've got is this generation. There are lots and lots and lots of other things that we'll get to, but at the same time, this generation is powerful, and I just, I also think just to kind of use common sense again. Have you ever in your life heard anyone talking about, saying, and of course we do those things, oh, what this generation lost their minds, or talking about, in my generation, have you ever heard anybody say that and assumed that they actually were not talking about that particular generation? It's crazy. The only reason people say it is because they say it hasn't happened yet. In another video, we're going to talk about it, because the nature of these eschatological things is a big problem that we need to deal with, because the nature is so assumed that it blinds people and deafens them and does this. Sometimes they can't even smell right, because the nature is so tightly held onto that they can't even possibly entertain the timing that is so abundantly clear, including this generation. So that's it for now. Hopefully this video will not take 2 days to upload. Pastor Joel saying bye for now.